A Cherokee warrior rides into a widow's life with a question that could change both their worlds forever. In a land divided by prejudice and survival, can two broken hearts find unity, not just for themselves, but for the children who need them most? Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you like the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The autumn winds swept through the hills of the Cherokee Nation in the Oklahoma Territory of 1879. Golden leaves scattered across the path as Running Wolf rode his chestnut stallion toward the small homestead nestled against the foothills. At 32 years old, his weathered face told stories of both battles fought and personal losses endured. The death of his wife Sarah during childbirth 2 years prior had left him to raise their daughter, Little Bird, alone. Little Bird was now a curious and energetic 2-year-old who needed more than what Running Wolf could provide on his own. His mother had helped care for the child, but her advancing age made it increasingly difficult. The tribal elders had suggested he consider finding a new wife, someone who could be a mother to Little Bird, and bring balance back to their home. As his horse crested the final hill, Running Wolf spotted the modest cabin that belonged to Elizabeth Parker, a white widow whose husband had died in a mining accident 6 months ago. Elizabeth had a 4-year-old son, Thomas, and struggled to maintain the homestead her husband had built at the edge of Cherokee territory. Running Wolf had first met Elizabeth at the trading post in the nearby settlement. He had noticed her struggling with supplies while trying to manage her restless son. When he offered assistance, she had initially regarded him with suspicion, as relations between settlers and Cherokee were often strained, but gratitude had soon replaced her wariness. Over the past few months, Running Wolf had made a point of checking on Elizabeth and Thomas, bringing them game from his hunts or helping with repairs around their property. Today, he carried a fresh deer he had killed at dawn. "Mr. Wolf," Thomas called out excitedly, spotting him from the yard where he was collecting kindling. The boy dropped his small bundle of sticks and ran toward the approaching rider. Running Wolf dismounted, smiling at the child's enthusiasm. "Hello, young Thomas. You are becoming a good worker for your mother." Elizabeth emerged from the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a simple bun, with stray tendrils framing her face. Despite the hardships she had endured, there was a quiet strength in her blue eyes. "Running Wolf," she greeted him with a small nod. "You didn't need to trouble yourself by coming all this way again." "No trouble," he replied, lifting the deer from his horse. "The hunt was good today. Too much for just Little Bird and me." Elizabeth's eyes softened as she looked at the deer. Pride prevented her from readily accepting charity, but practicality won out when it came to feeding her son. "Thomas and I are grateful," she said quietly. "Please come inside for some coffee while I prepare a portion to take home with you." The cabin was modest, but meticulously kept. A small fire crackled in the stone hearth, and the scent of fresh bread filled the air. Running Wolf ducked his head as he entered, acutely aware of his size in the small space. "Where is Little Bird today?" Thomas asked, peering around as if expecting to see the toddler hiding somewhere. "With my mother," Running Wolf answered, accepting the cup of coffee Elizabeth offered. "She is teaching her to weave baskets, though I think Little Bird is more interested in unraveling than weaving." Elizabeth smiled slightly, the first genuine smile he had seen from her today. Thomas was the same at that age, always undoing rather than creating. As Elizabeth began to prepare the deer, Running Wolf watched her skilled movements. She was no stranger to the tasks of survival. Yet, he could see the weariness in her shoulders, the strain of bearing all responsibilities alone. "Winter is coming soon," he said, looking out the small window at the golden red hills. "The elders say it will be harsh this year." Elizabeth's hands paused momentarily. "Yes, I've been worried about that. The roof still needs repair in 2 places, and I haven't gathered enough firewood yet. I can help with both," Running Wolf offered. "Tomorrow I will bring tools for the roof." Elizabeth turned to face him, her expression a complex mixture of gratitude and discomfort. "You've already done so much. I have nothing to offer in return." Running Wolf considered her words carefully. The time had come to speak of what had been growing in his mind these past months. "Elizabeth," he began, setting down his coffee cup, "I have watched you care for your son with great courage. I too know what it is to raise a child alone." She regarded him cautiously, sensing a shift in their conversation. Your son needs a father, Running Wolf continued. My daughter needs a mother. Perhaps we could help each other. Elizabeth's eyes widened and a flush crept up her neck. Are you suggesting marriage? Running Wolf nodded solemnly. A partnership for the children. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Outside, Thomas laughed as he chased a squirrel across the yard, oblivious to the life-changing conversation taking place inside. I don't know what to say, Elizabeth finally whispered. It's not done. A Cherokee man and a white woman. Some things are more important than what others think is done, Running Wolf replied. Think about it. I will return tomorrow for the roof. As he mounted his horse to leave, Elizabeth stood in the doorway, her expression troubled and thoughtful. Running Wolf knew he had given her much to consider, but as the first cold wind of the approaching winter brushed against his face, he felt certain that his proposal, though unexpected, was the right path forward for all of them. Behind him, Thomas waved enthusiastically, calling out, Goodbye, Mr. Wolf. Will you bring Little Bird tomorrow? Running Wolf raised his hand in farewell, noticing that Elizabeth made no move to correct her son's hopeful question. The promised dawn brought Running Wolf back to Elizabeth's homestead, his tools secured to his horse's saddle, and Little Bird nestled safely in a carrier on his back. The crisp morning air carried the scent of coming rain, making the roof repairs even more urgent. As they approached, Little Bird babbled excitedly, her small hands patting against her father's shoulders. Running Wolf could see Thomas already outside, jumping up and down and pointing as they came into view. They're here, Ma! They're here, Thomas shouted, running toward them with boundless energy. Elizabeth appeared in the doorway, looking as though she'd had little sleep. Her hair was neatly combed, however, and she'd put on a clean dress, signs that she'd made an effort for their arrival despite her obvious disquiet. Good morning, she called, her voice carrying a forced steadiness. I've prepared breakfast if you're hungry before you start on the roof. Running Wolf dismounted, lifting Little Bird from her carrier. The toddler looked around curiously, her dark eyes taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. This is Little Bird, Running Wolf said, setting her down carefully. Little Bird, this is Miss Elizabeth and Thomas. Thomas approached the small girl with unusual caution. She's tiny, he observed, crouching down to her level. Elizabeth knelt beside her son. She's younger than you, remember? You were that size once too. Little Bird regarded Thomas solemnly before breaking into a sudden smile and offering him a smooth stone she'd been clutching in her hand. That's her favorite treasure, Running Wolf explained as Thomas carefully accepted the gift. She gives it only to people she likes. Elizabeth's eyes met Running Wolf's over the children's heads. Something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement that regardless of their adult complications, the children seemed to have no trouble accepting one another. Inside, Elizabeth had prepared a hearty breakfast of cornbread, eggs, and salt pork. As they ate, Thomas chattered endlessly to Little Bird, who listened with rapt attention despite understanding little of what he said. Thomas has been talking non-stop about having a playmate today, Elizabeth said quietly to Running Wolf. He's been lonely out here with just me. Running Wolf nodded. Children need other children, and Little Bird has been asking for her new friend Thomas since yesterday. A comfortable silence fell between them as they watched the children interact. Running Wolf sensed that Elizabeth had been considering his proposal, but was not yet ready to discuss it. I should start on the roof, he said, after they had finished eating. The clouds suggest rain by midday. Elizabeth nodded. I'll watch Little Bird while you work. As Running Wolf climbed onto the roof with his tools, he could hear Elizabeth below, speaking softly to Little Bird as they gathered eggs from the small chicken coop. His daughter's delighted giggle at the discovery of each egg brought a smile to his face. From his vantage point, Running Wolf could see far across the rolling hills. The beauty of this land had been worth fighting for, worth preserving. His people had lost much in their forced relocation to the territory years before, but they had held on to their ways and rebuilt their lives. He wondered if Elizabeth could ever truly understand what it would mean to join her life with his, to become part of the Cherokee world while still existing in the white one. By midday, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon. Running Wolf had repaired the main leak and was working on the second when he heard a commotion below. Thomas's voice carried up to him, high with excitement. "Ma, men coming, 3 of them on horses." Running Wolf set down his hammer and moved to the edge of the roof. 3 riders approached from the direction of the settlement. He recognized one as William Hargrove, the owner of the general store, a man known for his distaste for Indians. Elizabeth hurried Thomas and Little Bird inside before stepping out to meet the riders. Running Wolf climbed down quickly, positioning himself beside her as the men reined in their horses. "Mrs. Parker," Hargrove said, tipping his hat while pointedly ignoring Running Wolf. "We were passing by and thought we'd check on you." His eyes drifted to the repairs on the roof. "I see you've got help, Mr. Hargrove," Elizabeth acknowledged coolly. "As you can see, we're managing fine." The man to Hargrove's right spat on the ground. "Ain't proper, a white woman alone with an Indian?" he muttered. Running Wolf remained impassive, though he felt tension coil within him. He had encountered such attitudes throughout his life, but it never ceased to ignite a quiet anger. Elizabeth straightened her spine. "Mr. Running Wolf has been kind enough to help with repairs before the winter. I'm grateful for his assistance." Hargrove's eyes narrowed. "There's talk in town, Mrs. Parker. People wondering about your situation out here. I'd be happy to send my boy over to help instead." "That won't be necessary," Elizabeth replied, her voice firm. "I choose who helps my family and who doesn't." A heavy silence followed her words. The unspoken challenge hung in the air between them. Finally, Hargrove shrugged. "Suit yourself, ma'am. Just thought you should know what people are saying." As the men turned to leave, the one who had spat looked directly at Running Wolf for the first time. "You'd best stick to your own kind, Indian." Running Wolf met his gaze steadily but said nothing. He had learned long ago when words were useful, and when they merely fed the fire of prejudice. After the riders disappeared over the hill, Elizabeth released a shaky breath. "I'm sorry about that," she said quietly. "You have nothing to apologize for," Running Wolf replied. "Their thoughts are not your responsibility." Thunder rumbled in the distance as they stood together, the coming storm a fitting backdrop to the tension that had just passed. "We should finish the roof quickly," Running Wolf said, turning back to the ladder. Elizabeth placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. "Running Wolf," she said, her voice low and determined. "About what you said yesterday." He waited, watching emotions play across her face. "I've been thinking about it all night," she continued. "It would not be easy. People like Hargrove would make it difficult for all of us." Running Wolf nodded. "Yes, this is true. But," Elizabeth said, her blue eyes meeting his directly, "Thomas needs more than I alone can give him. And I think we could help each other, as you said." The first raindrops began to fall, pattering softly around them. "I'm not promising anything," Elizabeth added quickly. "But perhaps you and Little Bird could stay for dinner, so we can talk more about this." Running Wolf felt something unlock in his chest. Not quite hope, but the possibility of it. "We would like that," he said simply. Inside, they found Thomas showing Little Bird how to stack wooden blocks. The children looked up as the adults entered, their innocent faces untroubled by the complexities that surrounded them. "Is Mr. Wolf going to stay?" Thomas asked hopefully. Elizabeth glanced at Running Wolf, a small smile touching her lips for the first time that day. "Yes," she answered. "They're going to stay for dinner." As the rain began to fall in earnest, the small cabin became a sanctuary against both the weather and the outside world's judgment. Running Wolf watched as Elizabeth moved about the kitchen, his daughter following her with curious eyes. Perhaps, he thought, they could indeed build something new here. A family forged not from common blood or backgrounds, but from shared need and growing respect. 3 weeks had passed since the day of the roof repairs, and the landscape had transformed with the deepening autumn. The forest surrounding Elizabeth's homestead blazed with fiery colors, and morning frost coated the ground like delicate lace. During these weeks, a tentative routine had developed. Running Wolf would arrive with Little Bird every few days, bringing game or helping with tasks around the property. The children had grown increasingly attached to one another, with Thomas taking his role as Little Bird's protector very seriously. Today, Running Wolf had come to help Elizabeth prepare for winter by splitting and stacking firewood. Little Bird and Thomas played nearby, building a small fort from sticks and fallen leaves under Elizabeth's watchful eye. As Running Wolf brought the axe down in rhythmic strokes, splitting log after log, Elizabeth approached with a cup of water. "You should rest a moment," she said, offering the drink. He accepted gratefully, taking a long swallow before setting the cup aside. "The work goes quickly. We will have enough wood before sundown." Elizabeth nodded, her gaze drifting to the children. "Thomas asked me last night why little Bird couldn't stay with us all the time," she said quietly. "He doesn't understand why you have to leave each evening." Running Wolf leaned the axe against the chopping block. "And what did you tell him?" "The truth, that we're still deciding if our arrangement would work." Elizabeth tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture Running Wolf had come to recognize as a sign of her nervousness. "I've been thinking that perhaps we should try a longer visit, to see how it might be if we were to—" She trailed off, unable to quite voice the word marry. Running Wolf considered her words. "The harvest festival begins in my village tomorrow. It lasts 3 days. Perhaps you and Thomas would come as my guests. You could stay in my home, see how life is there." Elizabeth's eyes widened slightly. "Your village. I don't know if that would be appropriate before we've made any formal commitment." "My mother would be there as chaperone," Running Wolf explained. "It would give you a chance to see the Cherokee way of life, to know what you and Thomas would be part of." He could see the conflict in her expression, curiosity warring with uncertainty. "Would your people accept us?" she asked finally. "A white woman and her son." Running Wolf chose his words carefully. "Some would welcome you immediately. Others might need time, just as some of your people may never accept me." He gestured toward the direction of town. "But many have white spouses or mixed blood. We are not as separate as some would believe." Elizabeth was silent for a moment, watching as Thomas carefully helped Little Bird place a large leaf atop their stick fort. The tenderness between the children was undeniable. "All right," she said at last. "We'll come to the festival, but I make no promises beyond that." Running Wolf inclined his head, respecting her cautious approach. "I ask for none." The next morning dawned clear and crisp. Elizabeth packed a small bag for herself and Thomas, her stomach fluttering with nervous energy. She had never been to a Cherokee celebration before, and worried about making mistakes or causing offense. When Running Wolf arrived to escort them, he brought a surprise, a gentle mare for Elizabeth to ride. "The walk is too far for Thomas," he explained, helping the excited boy onto his own stallion. The journey to the Cherokee village took most of the morning, winding through forested paths that Elizabeth had never traveled. Thomas chattered constantly, pointing out interesting rocks or animals they passed. Little Bird, secured in her carrier on her father's back, occasionally joined in with her own babbling commentary. As they crested a final hill, the village came into view. Elizabeth had expected something primitive, but what she saw surprised her. Well-constructed wooden houses and cabins formed a loose circle around a central clearing. Smoke rose from chimneys, and people moved about with purpose, preparing for the festival. Some wore traditional Cherokee clothing, while others dressed similarly to white settlers, showing the blending of cultures. "It's bigger than I thought it would be," Elizabeth commented as they approached. Running Wolf nodded. "Many families return to live together after the difficult journey to the territory. It gives us strength." Eyes turned toward them as they rode into the village, curious, assessing, but not openly hostile. A few people called out greetings to Running Wolf in Cherokee, which he answered in kind. Elizabeth felt uncomfortably conspicuous, but held her head high. An elderly woman emerged from one of the larger cabins, her silver hair braided down her back. Despite her age, she moved with purpose and dignity. Elizabeth immediately recognized the resemblance to Running Wolf in the woman's sharp eyes and proud bearing. "My mother, Morning Sky," Running Wolf said as they dismounted. Morning Sky approached, her gaze moving from Elizabeth to Thomas with frank appraisal. "Welcome to our home," she said in accented but clear English. "My son has spoken of you." Elizabeth offered her hand, unsure of the proper greeting. "Thank you for having us, Mrs." She paused, realizing she didn't know how to address the woman. A smile crinkled the corners of Morning Sky's eyes. "Morning Sky is enough. Come, you must be tired from the journey." Running Wolf's home was near his mother's, a well-built cabin with 2 rooms, simple but comfortable. As promised, Morning Sky would stay with them during their visit, occupying one room while Running Wolf gave the other to Elizabeth and Thomas. He himself would sleep in the main room near the fire. Throughout the afternoon, Elizabeth helped the Cherokee women prepare for the evening celebration. Initially, they worked in awkward silence, but gradually, conversation began. First about the food they were preparing, then about the children, and finally more personal exchanges. One woman, who introduced herself as Rose, worked alongside Elizabeth kneading dough for bread. "Your son plays well with Running Wolf's daughter," she observed. "They already act like brother and sister." Elizabeth glanced to where the children were helping to decorate the central gathering area with autumn leaves and dried corn husks. "Yes, they've become very attached." Rose nodded thoughtfully. "Running Wolf has been alone too long. Little Bird needs a mother's guidance." Before Elizabeth could respond, Rose added, "My husband is Cherokee. I came from a settler family near the Arkansas border. It was difficult at first, but now I cannot imagine any other life." Elizabeth looked at her with surprise. "You're white? I didn't realize," Rose laughed. "Yes, though sometimes I forget it myself now. There are several of us who have married into the tribe. We could help you, if you decide to stay." The simple acceptance in Rose's words touched Elizabeth deeply. Here was someone who understood the path she was considering, who had walked it herself. As evening fell, the festival began in earnest. Drums beat a steady rhythm, as dancers in traditional dress performed in the central clearing. Fires burned brightly, and tables groaned under the weight of food prepared by the community. Thomas was entranced by everything, especially the storyteller who shared tales of how the world began. Little Bird fell asleep in Elizabeth's lap halfway through the evening, her small weight warm and somehow already familiar. "She trusts you," Running Wolf said quietly, sitting beside Elizabeth as they watched the dancers. "She does not go easily to strangers." Elizabeth smoothed Little Bird's dark hair. "She's a special child. You've done well with her, even without her mother." Running Wolf's expression softened as he looked at his daughter. "Sarah would be pleased to see her now. She was a good woman, my wife." "Tell me about her," Elizabeth said, realizing they had never spoken much of their deceased spouses. As Running Wolf shared memories of Sarah, her laugh, her skill with medicines, her dreams for their child, Elizabeth felt not jealousy but connection. They both carried the weight of loss, the shadows of what might have been. When he finished, Elizabeth found herself speaking of her own husband, James, his determination to build a better life for them, his gentle way with Thomas, his final promise to return safely from the mine. "Sometimes I still expect to see him walking up the path to our cabin," she admitted. "Is that foolish after all this time?" Running Wolf shook his head. "The heart does not forget so quickly, but it can make room for new beginnings." Their eyes met over Little Bird's sleeping form, and Elizabeth felt something shift between them. A deeper understanding, perhaps, or the first true stirring of feelings beyond practical partnership. Later, as Elizabeth tucked Thomas into bed, he asked sleepily, "Can we stay here forever, Ma, with Mr. Wolf and Little Bird?" Elizabeth kissed his forehead. "We'll see, sweetheart. Now sleep." She stepped outside to find Running Wolf standing on the porch, looking up at the star-filled sky. "Your people have been kind to us today," Elizabeth said, joining him. "Kinder than I expected." Running Wolf nodded. "They see what I see, a woman of strength and a boy with a good heart." "And what is it exactly that you see in me, Running Wolf?" Elizabeth asked, surprising herself with her boldness. He turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "I see a woman who faces hardship without surrender, who loves her son enough to consider a life very different from what she planned." He paused. "And I see someone who makes me think of possibilities I had set aside." Elizabeth's heart quickened at his words. "This is all happening so fast," she whispered. "I hardly know what to think anymore." "Then don't think," Running Wolf said softly. "Just feel." For a moment they stood in silence, the sounds of the continuing celebration floating up from the center of the village. Then, hesitantly, Elizabeth reached out and took his hand in hers. His fingers closed around hers, warm and steady in the cool night air. No more words were needed as they stood together, two people from different worlds finding unexpected connection beneath the vast Oklahoma sky. The final day of the Harvest Festival brought with it a sense of impending decision. Elizabeth woke early, stepping quietly past where Running Wolf slept near the hearth. Outside, the pre-dawn air was sharp with cold, and mist clung to the ground in ethereal wisps. She wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders, taking a moment to absorb the peaceful beauty of the Cherokee village. In just 2 days, It had begun to feel less foreign, less intimidating. The people's initial reserve had gradually warmed, especially after seeing how Thomas had embraced their ways with childish enthusiasm. "The morning speaks to you." Morning Sky's voice came from behind her, making Elizabeth start slightly. "I couldn't sleep," Elizabeth admitted. "Too many thoughts." Morning Sky joined her, her weathered hands cradling a steaming cup. She offered it to Elizabeth. "Tea from blackberry leaves. It calms the spirit." Elizabeth accepted gratefully, sipping the earthy brew. "Thank you for welcoming us into your home. Everyone has been very kind." Morning Sky's shrewd eyes studied Elizabeth's face. "My son's heart has been closed since Sarah walked the spirit path. Now it opens again." She gestured toward the distant hills. "But the path ahead is not easy. Two worlds, not always friendly to each other." "I know," Elizabeth sighed. "That's what keeps me awake. Is it fair to the children to choose a life that might bring them hardship?" Morning Sky was silent for a moment before responding. "When the Great Removal came, many thought we could not survive. Too much hardship, too much loss. But we did survive. We found new ways." She placed a gentle hand on Elizabeth's arm. "The heart that is true finds its way through difficulty." As they stood together in companionable silence, Elizabeth realized that Morning Sky had just given her blessing, not with flowery words or explicit approval, but with the simple acknowledgement that challenges could be overcome. By mid-morning, the entire village had gathered for the final celebration, a ceremony giving thanks for the harvest and asking for protection through the coming winter. Elizabeth and Thomas sat with Running Wolf and Little Bird, welcomed into the circle as if they belonged. The tribal elder who led the ceremony spoke first in Cherokee, then repeated his words in English for those who did not speak the native tongue, a small gesture that touched Elizabeth deeply. It demonstrated how the community had adapted while maintaining their traditions. After the ceremony, there were games for the children and a communal feast. Thomas raced about with the Cherokee children, his blonde hair flashing in the sunlight as he laughed and played. Little Bird toddled after the older children, determined not to be left behind. "He belongs here already," Running Wolf observed as they watched Thomas successfully throw a small wooden hoop over a stake in a children's game, earning cheers from his new friends. Elizabeth nodded, her heart full as she watched her son's happiness. "He's never had so many playmates. At our cabin he was always alone." Running Wolf turned to her, his expression serious. "Elizabeth, I must return to your homestead with you today to collect the last of the firewood, but I would like to know your thoughts before we leave here." Elizabeth took a deep breath. The moment of decision had arrived. "I've been thinking about your proposal ever since you first made it. At first, I considered it only as a practical arrangement. A father for Thomas, a mother for Little Bird." She looked around at the village, at the community that had embraced them despite their differences. "But now, I see it could be more than that. The children could have a family, yes, but also a community, a place to belong." Running Wolf's eyes never left her face. "And for yourself, what do you see?" Elizabeth met his gaze directly. "I see a man of honor, a man who has shown me nothing but respect and kindness." Her voice softened. "A man I could grow to care for deeply, given time." A rare, full smile transformed Running Wolf's usually solemn features. "Then you will accept my proposal?" "Yes," Elizabeth said, the word both frightening and freeing. "Yes, I will marry you, Running Wolf." His hand found hers, strong and steady. "We will build a good life, Elizabeth, for ourselves and for our children." The journey back to Elizabeth's homestead was filled with plans and decisions. They would be married before the first snow, with ceremonies honoring both their traditions. They would live primarily at Running Wolf's cabin, which was larger and within the support of the community, but would maintain Elizabeth's homestead as well. Thomas, riding again with Running Wolf, was ecstatic at the news. "Does this mean Little Bird will be my sister, and Running Wolf will be my pa?" "Yes," Elizabeth answered, her heart warming at her son's joy. "We'll be a family now." Little Bird, understanding little of the conversation but sensing the happiness around her, clapped her tiny hands in delight. As they approached Elizabeth's cabin in the late afternoon, however, the mood shifted abruptly. 3 horses were tied outside, and William Hargrove stood on her porch with two other men from town. Running Wolf immediately tensed, and Elizabeth felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. They had been so wrapped in their newfound happiness that the outside world and its prejudices had momentarily faded from mind. "Stay with the children," Running Wolf said quietly, helping Elizabeth and Thomas down from their horses. "No," Elizabeth replied firmly. "We face this together." With Little Bird secure in her carrier on Running Wolf's back, and Thomas holding Elizabeth's hand, they approached the cabin together. Hargrove's face darkened when he saw them. "Mrs. Parker," he said, his tone clipped. "The town council sent us to check on you. You've been gone for days." "As you can see, Mr. Hargrove, I am perfectly well," Elizabeth replied evenly. "I was invited to the Cherokee Harvest Festival as a guest." One of the other men spat on the ground. "Ain't natural, a white woman staying with Indians." Elizabeth felt anger rise in her chest. "I would thank you not to speak that way in front of my son," she said coldly. Hargrove stepped forward. "Mrs. Parker, I'm speaking as a friend now. This has gone far enough. The town is willing to help you relocate closer to decent folks. This association," he gestured dismissively at Running Wolf, "is causing talk." Running Wolf remained impassive, but Elizabeth could sense his tension. Thomas pressed closer to her side, confused and frightened by the hostile atmosphere. Elizabeth drew herself up to her full height. "Mr. Hargrove, I appreciate the town's concern, but it is misplaced. Running Wolf has asked me to marry him, and I have accepted." A shocked silence followed her announcement. Hargrove's face flushed deep red. "You can't be serious, woman. Have you lost your mind? What about your boy?" Before Elizabeth could respond, Thomas spoke up, his young voice surprisingly steady. "Running Wolf is going to be my pa now, and Little Bird will be my sister." The simple truth in the child's words seemed to momentarily unbalance Hargrove and his companions. Elizabeth placed a protective hand on Thomas's shoulder. "My son has spoken our truth, gentlemen. Now, I must ask you to leave my property." "You're making a terrible mistake," Hargrove said, his voice hard. "The town won't stand for this. You'll be outcasts." Running Wolf finally spoke, his deep voice calm but authoritative. "Elizabeth and Thomas will have a community that accepts them. They will not be alone." The three men exchanged glances, clearly realizing that their intimidation tactics were failing. Hargrove made a final attempt. "Think of your husband, Mrs. Parker. What would James say if he could see you now?" Elizabeth felt a momentary pang at the mention of James, but it was quickly replaced by certainty. James would want his son to have a father who teaches him to be honorable and strong. He would want me to find happiness again. She took Running Wolf's hand deliberately. "I have found both." Defeated, the men mounted their horses and departed, but not without a final warning from Hargrove. "Don't come crying to town when you regret this decision." As the dust from their horses settled, Elizabeth released a shaky breath. Running Wolf squeezed her hand gently. "Are you certain about this path, Elizabeth? It will not be the last difficulty we face." Elizabeth looked at Running Wolf, at Little Bird peering curiously over his shoulder, and at Thomas standing brave and tall beside her. The four of them, so different yet already forming bonds that felt unbreakable.